The air in the railcar was thick with the suffocating heat of a Texas summer, heavy with the scent of steel, sweat, and the bitter dust of defeat. For the German officer slumped against the window, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track was a monotonous funeral drum, marking his journey deeper into the heart of an enemy nation. His hands, which had once held a rifle with resolute certainty on the battlefields of North Africa, now lay limp in his lap. He and his comrades were prisoners of war, a remnant of the once feared Afrika Corps, now being transported to an unknown fate. They had been told what to expect. A decadent, crumbling nation, weakened by racial impurity and on the verge of economic collapse. A paper tiger. The train slowed as it approached a rural crossing. Through the grime-streaked glass, the officer watched a small scene unfold that would forever alter the course of his understanding. An American railroad worker, his face weathered by the sun, stood by the tracks. He took a long, final swig from a uniquely shaped, dark glass bottle, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. It was a bottle of Coca-Cola. Then, in a single, fluid motion of casual indifference, he tossed the empty bottle into the tall grass by the side of the tracks. It disappeared with a faint thud. The train picked up speed again, and the man receded into the distance, but the image was seared into the officer's mind. To an American observer, it was nothing. A piece of litter, a moment of thoughtlessness. But to this German soldier, it was an explosion. It was a spectacle, more shocking than an artillery barrage. Back home, in the Third Reich, that single glass bottle was a strategic resource. It would have been collected by a dutiful member of the Hitler Youth, counted, sorted, and sent back to a factory to be melted down and repurposed for the war effort. Every scrap of metal, every shard of glass, every ounce of rubber was hoarded with a desperate, patriotic fervor. To simply throw such a thing away, it wasn't just wastefulness. It was a display of wealth so profound, so careless, that it bordered on the obscene. It spoke of a nation that had so much, it had forgotten the value of a single, empty bottle. This officer was a man named Hetman Friedrich Radke, a decorated soldier who had earned the Iron Cross for his service. He was a product of a system built on discipline, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief in German superiority. And yet, in his diary that night, under the dim light of a bare bulb in a Texas prison camp, he is said to have written a line that captured the beginning of a profound psychological unraveling. Today, the entry reportedly read, "I saw something more fearsome than the entire Allied fleet. I saw the carelessness of wealth." That single, discarded bottle was the first crack in the monolithic wall of propaganda that had been meticulously constructed around these soldiers since their youth. They were the sons of the fatherland, warriors for a noble cause against a world conspiring to keep Germany on its knees. They had been fed a steady diet of stories and images by Goebbels' ministry, portraying the United States as a chaotic, mongrel nation. It was a country, they were told, torn apart by crime, racial strife, and Wall Street corruption, a hollow giant whose industrial might was a myth, propped up by Jewish bankers, and destined to collapse under the slightest pressure. They had marched into battle, believing this with every fiber of their being. How could a nation on the brink of ruin afford to discard resources that Germany bled for? What kind of society produced workers who could treat a valuable object with such contemptuous ease? The questions began to fester, silently, in the minds of Radke and thousands of other POWs. If the leaders of the Reich had been so fundamentally wrong about something as simple as the enemy's material wealth, what else were they wrong about? What other lies had they been told? The American guards on the train had been surprisingly nonchalant. They weren't the snarling brutes of Nazi propaganda. They were young men, some of them barely out of their teens, who chewed gum and read comic books, seemingly unimpressed by their cargo of elite German soldiers. Their casual confidence was in itself unsettling. They behaved not like men who were winning a desperate war, but like men who were simply doing a job, with the outcome already assured. This quiet, unstated certainty was perhaps more unnerving than open hostility. It hinted at a power that didn't need to boast or intimidate. The journey into the American heartland was becoming a psychological siege. Every mile of track revealed a new contradiction, a new piece of evidence that challenged their entire worldview. The sheer, vast emptiness of the country was confounding. They traveled for days, and still, there was more land, more space, more resources than they could have possibly imagined. The endless fields of wheat, the countless herds of cattle, the forests that stretched to the horizon. It was a portrait of a continent blessed with a seemingly infinite bounty, a stark contrast to the cramped, resource-starved reality of Lebensraum they had been fighting to secure. The Coca-Cola bottle was not an isolated incident. It was an omen. It was the first small tremor that signals a coming earthquake, a quiet harbinger of the mental and ideological devastation to come. For Hetman Radke and the nearly 400,000 other German prisoners of war who would be held in America, this journey was the beginning of an education more potent than any lecture or pamphlet. They were about to witness, firsthand, the true source of America's power. It wasn't found in its armies, but in the casual confidence of its people, in the overwhelming output of its factories, and in the unbelievable abundance that allowed a simple workman to throw away a treasure without a second thought. Their battle for Germany was over. A new, internal battle for their own minds was just beginning. Before they could be shipped to the vast plains of Texas or the deserts of Arizona, the German prisoners were first processed in sprawling, hastily constructed camps along the North African coast. Here, under the relentless Algerian sun, they expected the harsh realities of defeat to truly begin. They anticipated meager rations, rough handling, and the contempt of their captors. Instead, they encountered the second jarring anomaly of their new existence: the quiet, terrifying efficiency of the American military machine. Tens of thousands of men were disarmed, documented, fed, and housed with a logistical precision that seemed almost effortless. There were no chaotic lines, no critical shortages. It was an organization on a scale they had only seen in propaganda films about their own army. And then there was the food. It arrived like a quiet, relentless assault on their ideology. In Germany, a civilian's weekly ration of meat was a mere 300 grams, if they were lucky. The German army itself was running on coarse rye bread and thin soup. Yet here, in a dusty camp in the middle of nowhere, they were given white bread, a luxury reserved for the Nazi Party elite. They were served coffee, with real sugar and milk. They were given portions of meat not once, but often twice a day. It was baffling. It was insulting. How could a nation so far from its own shores provide better for its captured enemies than the Third Reich could provide for its own loyal citizens? Among the prisoners, a dangerous seed of dissent began to sprout. The most fanatical officers, recognizable by their rigid posture and sneering disapproval, tried to maintain order. They would organize clandestine drills and demand that their men show defiance. They insisted that this abundance was a temporary trick, a psychological ploy to soften them before the inevitable harshness to come. Do not be fooled by this Jewish generosity. One Oberleutnant was heard warning his platoon. They fattened the pig before the slaughter. Yet, for every true believer, there were a dozen others who couldn't ignore the simple, gnawing truth in their bellies. This was not a trick. This was simply supply. The next stage of their journey was the voyage across the Atlantic. The prisoners were marched to the docks, where they saw not a handful of ships, but a horizon filled with them. It was a sprawling, endless armada of cargo vessels, tankers, and troop transports, all painted in a uniform, dull gray. These were the legendary Liberty ships, the workhorses of the Allied war effort. Back in Germany, they had been dismissed by Nazi propaganda as primitive coffins, poorly made and easily sunk. The reality was far more intimidating. They were told by a German-speaking American sailor that these ships were being built in American shipyards at a staggering rate. Sometimes one was launched every 4 to 5 days. It wasn't about quality in the German sense of exquisite, time-consuming craftsmanship. It was about quantity. It was about overwhelming the enemy with sheer, undeniable numbers. On board, a rigid social order quickly fractured. The die-hard Nazis sought each other out, forming small, isolated cliques. They spoke of secret weapons, of the Führer's brilliant strategic withdrawals, and of the inevitable turning of the tide. But a growing faction of pragmatists, engineers, technicians, and veteran non-commissioned officers began to see the world for what it was. One such man, a lieutenant who had worked for a major German engineering firm before the war, spent hours observing the American naval destroyers that escorted their convoy. He watched them through a stolen pair of binoculars, noting the sophisticated radar arrays spinning ceaselessly atop their masts. After 2 days of silent observation, he allegedly turned to a fellow officer and stated flatly, "It's over. They can see us in the present, dark and in the fog, from 30 kilometers away. We are fighting with spears against lightning. All of this," he said, gesturing to the German prisoners on the deck, "is just the final accounting." The true test of their fracturing ideologies came in the form of a ferocious Atlantic storm. For 3 days, the convoy was battered by colossal waves and shrieking winds. The Liberty ship, true to its utilitarian design, pitched and rolled violently, sending waves of seasickness through the packed holds where the prisoners were kept. In this moment of shared misery and fear, the true believers saw an opportunity. A group of SS officers and zealous young soldiers gathered in a corner of the hold and began to sing. Their voices rose, thin and strained against the roar of the ocean, singing Das Lied der Deutschen and the Horst Wessel Lied, anthems of defiance and national pride. It was a desperate attempt to impose their will on the chaos, to remind themselves and everyone around them that they were still soldiers of the Reich. But while they sang, a different, far more powerful drama was unfolding. A young German private, barely 19 years old, was on sanitation duty, helping an American crewman clear the galley. The ship heaved, and stacks of metal trays crashed to the floor. The American sailor cursed, picked them up, and then proceeded with his task. The young private watched, mesmerized, as the sailor began to dispose of the day's leftovers. He wasn't scraping plates into a small bin. He was taking whole, uneaten loaves of bread, large chunks of beef, and pans of potatoes and simply throwing them into a large canvas sack destined for the ocean. The private, whose family in Stuttgart was subsisting on potato peels and ration cards, could not comprehend what he was seeing. He watched as the American sailor, a man no older than himself, dumped this treasure trove of food as if it were garbage. In the middle of a life-threatening storm, surrounded by the enemy, the single, most pressing concern for the American crew was not rationing, but waste disposal. The German boy's patriotic songs died in his throat. The sight of that discarded food was a wave far more powerful than any that struck the ship. It washed away the last vestiges of his belief in victory. The singing of the fanatics now sounded not like defiance, but like a pathetic, foolish dirge. When the storm finally broke, a heavy silence settled over the prisoners. The singers were quiet, their bravado gone. The whispers among the pragmatists grew louder and more confident. The questions were no longer about whether Germany could win, but about how their leaders could have been so catastrophically, so fundamentally wrong about their enemy. They had been told they were fighting a degenerate nation of bankers and gangsters, but the evidence of their own senses suggested they were challenging a titan of industry whose power was so vast it could afford to throw away more food in a single day than a German family saw in a month. If this is how they treat their garbage, one prisoner was overheard saying to another in the quiet of the hold, "What in God's name are they going to do with us?" The question hung in the salty air, unanswered. They were headed for Norfolk, Virginia, the doorstep of the American mainland. Their journey across the physical ocean was ending, but a much larger, more terrifying crossing over an ocean of lies had just begun. The port of Norfolk, Virginia, was not a harbor. It was a living creature, a colossal beast of logistics that breathed steel and exhaled ships. As the German POWs were marched onto the docks, they expected the familiar sights of a wartime port. The chaotic shouting, the choking black smoke of coal engines, the strained groan of overworked machinery. Instead, they were met with an eerie, humming efficiency. There was no smoke. Towering cranes, powered by silent electricity, moved with a balletic grace, plucking entire tanks and trucks from the decks of ships as if they were children's toys. The air was clean, filled only with the scent of the sea and the low thrum of limitless power. But it wasn't the scale of the operation that delivered the first, staggering blow to their ingrained ideology. It was the operators. Peering down from the control cabin of a crane that was effortlessly guiding a multi-ton Sherman tank through the air was a woman, her hair tied up in a bandana. On the docks below, a forklift loaded with crates of ammunition was being driven with practiced precision by an African-American man. All around them, women, black men, and even teenagers who looked barely old enough to shave were part of this symphony of production, each one a master of their complex machine. For a soldier of the Third Reich, this was a reality more alien than the surface of the moon. Their entire worldview was built on a rigid hierarchy of race and gender. The woman's place was in the home, producing children for the fatherland. The black man was, according to their doctrine, an inferior being, incapable of skilled labor. Yet here, the decadent and mongrelized society of America was not just functioning. It was performing an industrial miracle with a diverse workforce that Nazi Germany would have deemed unthinkable. The sight was a silent, powerful refutation of everything they had been taught to believe. It suggested that America's strength didn't come from racial purity, but perhaps from the very diversity they scorned. Their journey inland began, and with it came the next assault on their perceptions. They had been told they would be transported in cattle cars, a fitting transport for defeated subhumans. They braced for the indignity. The doors of the train slid open to reveal not splintered wood and straw, but cushioned seats and wide windows. They were in Pullman passenger cars. As a small, almost comical touch of reality, the air conditioning in many of the cars was broken, making the journey through the humid South intensely uncomfortable. But even this flaw was a luxury. The idea of air conditioning on a troop train at all was a level of opulence they couldn't fathom. As the train cut a path through the American landscape, the prisoners stared, transfixed, through the windows. What they saw was a continuous, flowing river of steel and glass on the highways that ran parallel to the tracks. It was an endless parade of automobiles. At first, they tried to rationalize it. These must be military convoys, or the vehicles of high-ranking government officials. But the cars were too varied, too colorful. There were family sedans, dusty farm trucks, and flashy coupes, and the people driving them were not generals or party functionaries. They were factory workers in greasy overalls, farmers in straw hats, women returning from market. One German officer, an aristocrat from Prussia, reportedly watched this spectacle for hours, his face a mask of disbelief. Finally, he turned to the man next to him. "If these are the cars of the workers," he murmured, "what must the garages of the rich look like?" The question was unanswerable. They were witnessing a society where the common man possessed a level of mobility and personal wealth reserved only for the highest elite in their own country. Night fell, but the revelations did not stop. As the train sped through Ohio, Pennsylvania, and onward, the darkness outside was constantly pierced by light. Back in Germany, cities were under strict blackout orders. A single stray light could invite a devastating bombing raid. The nights were deep, primal, and full of fear. But here, the night was ablaze. Factory complexes, larger than entire towns back home, glowed with the light of 1,000 suns. Operating around the clock, town after small town drifted by, their streetlights casting warm pools of yellow on empty sidewalks. Even isolated farmhouses had porch lights burning, defiant beacons of wasted electricity in the vast darkness. One prisoner, Unoffizier Verheer Burkhardt, wrote in his secret diary about the profound psychological impact of this sight. He felt a creeping sense of dread, realizing that a nation that could afford to illuminate its nights with such casual abandon was a nation for whom energy, the very lifeblood of a modern war machine, was not a concern. It was infinite. It flowed like water. The ultimate symbol of this incomprehensible power came when their train was shunted onto a siding to allow another to pass. This train was different. It was composed of hundreds of flat cars, and on each one was the fuselage or wing assembly of a B-24 Liberator bomber. It was a train of airplane parts, stretching for more than a mile. A guard, noticing their awe, casually remarked, "That's just a few hours' work from the factory up at Willow Run." Later, in the camps, they would learn the full, terrifying truth of that name. Willow Run was not a factory. It was an industrial nation-state. It was a single building so vast that workers used bicycles to get from one end to the other. At its peak, it was producing a fully completed, four-engine heavy bomber every 63 minutes. A German officer who had been a senior engineer in the Messerschmitt Aviation Company tried to mentally calculate the logistics. The amount of aluminum, the miles of wiring, the number of rivets, the manpower, and above all, the electrical power required for such a feat seemed to defy the laws of physics. He concluded that the Willow Run plant alone likely consumed more electricity than the entire city of Munich. After reaching this conclusion, he reportedly fell into a deep depression, refusing to speak for days. He understood, in a way the others could not, that Germany was not just fighting an army. It was fighting a spreadsheet. It was fighting a production schedule. It was fighting an opponent that could conjure miracles of steel and fire from thin air. The prisoners had been stripped of their weapons, their freedom, and their pride. But this journey was stripping them of something far more fundamental: their certainty. The industrial might they had witnessed was a weapon in itself, a relentless psychological bombardment that was systematically dismantling their will to resist. Yet, as the train finally rolled to a stop in the heart of Texas, they were about to discover that this arsenal of democracy had another weapon in its inventory, one they were entirely unprepared for. It was a weapon not of overwhelming force, but of unexpected kindness, and it would prove to be the most devastating of all. The gates of the POW camp in Mexia, Texas, closed behind them with a heavy, final clang. This, they thought, was the end of the line. Here, the pretense would end, and the true nature of their captors would be revealed. They braced themselves for the squalor they had always been told was the fate of prisoners: cramped, filthy barracks, disease, starvation, and the casual brutality of guards who viewed them as less than human. What they found instead was another assault on their sanity. The camp was not a pit of despair, but a meticulously planned, functional small town. The wooden barracks were simply built, but clean and weatherproof. There were neat gravel paths, patches of grass, and even designated areas for sports. They were issued clean uniforms, bedding, and personal hygiene kits. The camp had a library, a workshop, a theater for putting on plays, and even an orchestra formed from the many talented musicians among the prisoners. It was a prison, yes, encircled by barbed wire and watchtowers, but it was a prison that operated with a sense of order and dignity that was profoundly disorienting. The daily food ration was the most powerful weapon in this psychological war. It was calculated to be the exact same caloric intake as that of an American GI in basic training. The prisoners were fed pork chops, roast beef, potatoes, fresh vegetables, and desserts. For men who had been slowly starving on the front lines, it was a constant, undeniable testament to the enemy's bottomless resources. This wasn't a temporary feast designed to trick them. This was the daily, monotonous, industrial-scale output of American agriculture. This strange new reality created a painful, invisible chasm between the prisoners and their families back home. The men were allowed to write letters, and many tried to share the truth, hoping to alleviate the fears of their loved ones. A young German corporal named Klaus, after 3 months in a camp in Arizona, penned a letter to his wife in Hamburg. He wrote with the simple honesty of a man trying to connect across an impossible distance. He told her not to worry, that he was safe. He described, with a hint of wonder, the Sunday meals that often included roasted chicken. He mentioned that he had gained nearly 10 pounds and that his lingering cough from the war had finally disappeared in the dry desert air. He sealed the letter filled with a desperate hope that his words could bring her a small measure of peace. 6 months later, a reply arrived. Its journey across a war-torn world, a small miracle in itself. The envelope was worn, the ink blurred by moisture, and the clumsy slicing of the American censor. Klaus's hands trembled as he read his wife's words. They were not words of relief, but of agony. "My dearest, brave Klaus," she wrote, "your letter arrived, and my heart breaks with pride for your incredible courage. To endure their tortures, and still pretend for my sake that you are well. You are a true German soldier. Please, my love, do not feel you must lie to me. I know what those savage animals are doing to you. Your stories of chicken and gaining weight. I understand. You are telling me to stay strong. I am. We are all starving here, but our spirit is not broken. We will hold out until our Führer achieves the final victory. Be brave." Klaus read the letter 3 times, the words blurring into an incomprehensible script of sorrow. He had tried to send her the truth, and it had been received as a lie. The propaganda that had shaped his own mind was now a wall between him and the person he loved most. He was physically healthier than he had been in years, but he was more isolated than ever before. His well-being was a truth so fantastic, so completely at odds with the reality his wife was living, that it had become a source of pain, not comfort. He was a castaway on an island of plenty, unable to convince the starving world he left behind that such a place even existed. This sense of moral and medical superiority was reinforced in the camp hospital. The chief German medical officer, a highly respected surgeon named Oberstleutnant Dr. Friedrich Bauer, was initially appalled by what he saw as the Americans' wasteful medical practices. Then, a young German soldier was brought in with a deep shrapnel wound that had developed a raging infection. In a German field hospital, it would have been a near-certain death sentence, a slow, agonizing slide into sepsis. Dr. Bauer prepared for a grim amputation, but the American camp doctor, a quiet major from Ohio, simply cleaned the wound and administered an injection of a new, yellowish drug. Bauer watched, skeptical. The next day, the soldier's fever had dropped. The day after, the swelling was visibly reduced. Within a week, the boy was on the road to a full recovery, his limbs saved. The drug, the American doctor explained, was called penicillin. Dr. Bauer was stunned into silence. He knew of penicillin. It was a near-mythical wonder drug in Germany, so rare that its use was restricted to the highest echelons of the Nazi Party. To see it used so liberally, so effectively, on a common enemy soldier, it was a moment of profound revelation. This was not just a display of industrial might, but of a different value system. The Americans were using their most advanced medical technology to save the life of an enemy, not because it was strategically useful, but simply because it was the humane thing to do. The final daily lesson in this gilded cage often came from the most mundane of places, the camp kitchen. A young private named Gunther was assigned to KP duty. His first day, he was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of food. Sacks of potatoes taller than he was, crates of fresh oranges, sides of beef that took 2 men to lift. At the end of the evening meal, the American mess sergeant, a gruff but not unkind man, pointed to the leftovers. "Okay, kid," he said. "Trash it all." Gunther stared at him, uncomprehending. On the counter were 3 large trays. One held at least a dozen loaves of white bread, some of them completely untouched. Another contained a small mountain of fried chicken, perhaps a quarter of it uneaten. Gunther thought of his mother's recent letter, which spoke of the joy of finding enough acorns to grind into a bitter flour to bake a small, hard loaf of bread for his younger sisters. He looked at the sergeant, certain he had misunderstood. "All of it?" he asked in broken English. "Yeah, all of it," the sergeant grunted, not looking up. "Can't serve day-olds. Regulations." Hesitantly, Gunther lifted the heavy tray of bread. Its weight felt like a moral crime. He carried it to the large metal garbage cans behind the kitchen. As he tilted the tray, and the perfect, life-giving loaves tumbled into the filth with a soft thud, something inside him broke. He leaned against the wall, the empty tray clattering to the ground, and began to sob. They were not the quiet tears of homesickness, but the deep, racking sobs of a man witnessing the absolute certainty of his own defeat. The songs, the speeches, the banners, the belief in their destiny, it all evaporated in the face of this single, casual act of impossible abundance. He later wrote, "It was there, with my hands on a fortune of wasted bread, that I knew for certain. We were not just defeated, we were irrelevant." The prisoners were being fattened, healed, and sheltered, and with every act of care, their ideological foundations were being systematically eroded. Their bodies were thriving, while their core beliefs were being starved into submission. But this was only the passive stage of their transformation. The American authorities had a far more ambitious and audacious plan in mind. They were not content to simply let the prisoners observe the power of democracy. They were about to invite them to study it, to debate it, and even to criticize it. The Americans were about to show them not just their strengths, but their weaknesses too. And this, the ultimate act of institutional self-confidence, would be the most powerful blow of all. The physical needs of the German prisoners had been met with an abundance that bordered on the surreal. Their bodies were healing, their bellies were full, but their minds remained a battleground. The American High Command, however, was not content with merely winning a passive war of attrition against Nazi ideology. They were about to launch a direct, strategic assault. In a move of extraordinary foresight, a clandestine program was initiated, developed not by generals, but by professors from America's top universities. Its goal was not indoctrination, but education. Its purpose was to dismantle Nazism, not with brute force, but with irrefutable logic and the shocking power of intellectual freedom. Special camps were designated, and prisoners who showed intellectual curiosity or disillusionment with the Reich were quietly transferred. Here, they entered a world that resembled a university campus more than a prison. They were offered courses in American history, English language, political science, and even skilled trades. The instructors were often German-American academics who had fled the rise of Hitler. They spoke the prisoners' language, understood their culture, and, most importantly, taught their subjects without a trace of hatred or triumphalism. They presented facts, moderated discussions, and treated their students not as defeated enemies, but as men who had been tragically misled. The centerpiece of this intellectual offensive, however, was the camp's movie night. The prisoners would file into a makeshift theater, expecting to be bombarded with crude American propaganda films, showcasing flawless American heroes and demonic German villains. The Nazi hardliners in the audience were ready for this, eager to mock the enemy's clumsy attempts at brainwashing. The projectors whirred to life, and the film began. But it wasn't what anyone expected. On the screen flickered the harsh, black and white images of John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. The prisoners watched, spellbound, as the story of the Joad family unfolded, a story of crushing poverty, Dust Bowl desperation, and the exploitation of migrant workers during the Great Depression. They saw Americans who were starving, homeless, and treated with contempt by their own countrymen. For the first few reels, a palpable sense of vindication filled the room. The zealous Nazis nudged each other, whispering triumphantly. "See," one was heard to hiss. "It is just as the Führer told us. A decadent nation, rotten to the core, built on the suffering of its own people." They saw the film not as a story, but as an unwitting confession of America's weakness. But as the film continued, a different, more unsettling realization began to dawn on the more perceptive prisoners. They started to ask a dangerous question. Why? Why would the Americans show this to them? The Goebbels propaganda machine, which had defined their entire reality, was built on the principle of projecting an image of unflinching strength and national perfection. Any flaw, any sign of internal dissent or suffering, was ruthlessly suppressed. To admit weakness was to invite defeat. Yet, here were the Americans, not only admitting to their own profound social problems, but presenting them with high artistic merit for their enemies to see. The truth landed like a silent explosion in the minds of the thinkers in the room. This wasn't a confession of weakness. It was the ultimate demonstration of strength. Only a nation supremely confident in its own foundations, a society so fundamentally secure in its ability to overcome its own flaws, would dare to engage in such a level of public self-criticism. It was a flex of political and cultural muscle, far more intimidating than any tank or battleship. The film was a statement. We have problems. We know we have problems. We are strong enough to show them to the world, and we are strong enough to fix them. The camp's prisoner-run newspaper, which had previously been a dull mouthpiece for Nazi sympathizers, suddenly became a hotbed of debate. Letters to the editor argued fiercely about the film. One side denounced it as a trick. The other argued that it was proof of a superior system. The division that had begun on the transport ship now hardened into well-defined factions. The true believers retreated further into their shell of denial, labeling anyone who engaged with the American ideas as a veritor, a traitor. They saw their comrades' intellectual curiosity as a form of spiritual surrender. This clash of ideas was most potent in the classroom. In one political science seminar, a defiant Luftwaffe captain, a man who still believed in the righteousness of their cause, stood up to challenge the professor. "This democracy you speak of is chaos," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "It is the rule of the ignorant mob, swayed by Jewish newspapers. A nation needs one leader, one will, one voice to guide it to greatness. That is the only thing that creates strength." The classroom fell silent. The other prisoners tensed, expecting the officer to be dragged away and punished for his insolence. The American professor, a mild-mannered man from Columbia University, simply adjusted his glasses. He looked at the captain, not with anger, but with academic interest. "An interesting perspective, Captain," he said calmly. "Thank you for sharing it. You've just articulated the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle. Now, let's analyze that. What are its strengths? More importantly, what are its potential weaknesses? Let's open the floor for discussion." The effect was electric. The captain, prepared for a fight, was left disarmed by the invitation to debate. The other prisoners, slowly, hesitantly, began to raise their hands. A former law student from Heidelberg timidly questioned the lack of legal checks on a single leader's power. An engineer wondered if a system with only one voice was capable of correcting its own technical or strategic errors. For the first time, these men were participating in an open, critical discussion about the very foundations of their political world. The freedom to question, to argue, to disagree with authority, even as a prisoner of war, was a concept so alien and so intoxicating that it began to irrevocably change them. They were not being told that democracy was better. They were experiencing its core principle in action. The seeds of doubt, sown by discarded Coke bottles and mountains of wasted food, were now being carefully watered and cultivated in the fertile ground of open debate. The monolithic certainty of the Nazi worldview was cracking, splintering into 100 different questions. But an ideology, especially one embraced with such fanatical devotion, does not die easily. It clings to hope and rationalization until the very end. For the ideology of the Third Reich to be completely shattered, it would require two final, devastating shocks. One would come from the battlefields of France, a testament to the industrial might they had already witnessed. The other would come from the darkest corners of their own homeland, a revelation of moral depravity so profound it would eclipse everything they had ever known. The final act of their transformation was about to begin. By the spring of 1944, a fragile, surreal equilibrium had settled over the hundreds of POW camps scattered across America. The prisoners had fallen into routines of work, study, and sport, living in a strange limbo between their shattered past and an uncertain future. For many, the intellectual seeds of doubt had taken root, but for the most hardened believers, a desperate hope still flickered. They clung to the myth of the Endsieg, the final victory, believing that the Führer must have a secret strategy, a Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapon, that would soon be unleashed to turn the tide of the war. They spoke of the Atlantic Wall, the supposedly impregnable fortress of coastal defenses that would repel any Allied invasion and bleed their armies dry on the beaches of France. On the 6th of June 1944, that final hope was extinguished. The news of D-Day rippled through the camps, delivered by American guards and blared from camp radios. At first, it was met with derision and disbelief. A trick, the die-hard officers scoffed. Goebbels has warned us of this propaganda. They will be thrown back into the sea by nightfall. They gathered in confident clusters, poring over outdated maps of Europe, predicting the swift and total failure of the invasion. But as the days turned into a week, the reports did not cease. Instead, they grew in scope and detail, painting a picture not of a failed raid, but of a logistical achievement so vast it defied imagination. The prisoners heard the numbers. Over 5,000 ships in the invasion fleet, 11,000 aircraft providing cover, over 150,000 men, landing on the first day alone. The names they had dismissed as propaganda now became terrifyingly real. The Liberty ships they had crossed the Atlantic on were not just transports. They were part of an endless bridge of steel spanning the English Channel. The B-24 Liberators, assembled at Willow Run, were not just symbols of production. They were now darkening the skies over Normandy, dropping a relentless storm of bombs. The industrial beast they had witnessed from their train windows had finally turned its full, undivided attention to the destruction of the Third Reich. A heavy, funereal silence descended upon the camps. The once boastful SS officers now walked with their eyes fixed on the ground, their certainty shattered. Their discussions of wonder weapons and strategic genius evaporated. They were engineers, tacticians, and soldiers. They could do the math. They understood that no amount of fighting spirit or ideological purity could stand against such an overwhelming avalanche of materiel. The war was lost. It was now merely a question of how many more would have to die before the end. This was the final, crushing intellectual defeat. Their belief in victory was dead. The war in Europe ground on for another agonizing year before the final German surrender in May 1945. For the prisoners in America, the end of the fighting brought not relief, but a profound and anxious dread. They were now the remnants of a defeated and disgraced nation, but they still held onto one last, tattered thread of their identity. They were soldiers. They had fought, they believed, with honor for their country, misled by politicians, but honorable in their duty. This last shred of self-respect was all they had left, and it was about to be obliterated. The American authorities made a final, calculated decision. They understood that for Germany to be rebuilt as a peaceful nation, these men, who would one day become its leaders, teachers, and builders, had to confront the absolute moral truth of the regime they had served. In camps across the country, prisoners were ordered to assemble in the theaters and mess halls. There was no explanation. They sat in confused silence as the lights dimmed and the projectors began to roll. This was not a Hollywood film. There was no story, no actors, no music. It was raw, grainy, silent newsreel, a footage, shot by Allied cameramen who had entered the newly liberated concentration camps of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau. The first images flickered onto the screen, skeletal figures in striped pajamas, staring at the camera with hollow eyes that contained no emotion, only a terrifying emptiness. Then came the piles of shoes, mountains of them, reaching to the ceiling of a warehouse, piles of eyeglasses, piles of human hair. The prisoners watched in a state of stunned, uncomprehending silence. What was this? Some bizarre, grotesque piece of propaganda? Then the camera moved to the bulldozers. American and British soldiers, their faces grim masks of horror and disgust, were pushing mountains of emaciated, naked corpses into mass graves. The camera did not flinch. It lingered on the skeletal limbs, the contorted faces, the sheer, industrial scale of the slaughter. A collective gasp went through the hall, a sound of strangled horror. Men began to look away, but there was nowhere to hide their eyes. Some stood up and stumbled for the exits, their faces pale green. Others simply bent over where they sat and vomited. The stoic, hardened veterans of Stalingrad and El Alamein, Men who had seen the worst of combat began to weep uncontrollably, their bodies shaking with deep, gut-wrenching sobs. For these soldiers, this was not just a revelation of their government's evil. It was a deeply personal annihilation. The uniform they had worn with pride was the same uniform worn by the guards in those camps. The oath they had sworn to the Führer was an oath to the architect of this genocide. Every battle they had fought, every comrade they had lost, every sacrifice their families had made, it had all been in service to this unimaginable crime against humanity. In the suffocating silence that followed the film, a single voice cried out from the back of the hall, a raw scream of pure agony and self-loathing. "Wir waren keine Soldaten," the man shrieked, his voice cracking with despair. "Wir waren die Handlanger von Metzgern." We were not soldiers, we were the henchmen for butchers. That cry shattered the last vestiges of their identity. It was the terrible, undeniable truth. Their honor was a lie. Their cause was a monstrosity. They were not tragic heroes of a lost war. They were the foot soldiers of a criminal enterprise, the tools of mass murderers. The realization was a poison that seeped into the soul of every man present. They had entered that room as defeated German soldiers. They left it as something else entirely. Morally bankrupt citizens of a nation that had committed an unforgivable sin. The war had ended, but their personal torment had just begun. The question was no longer simply when they would go home. The question that would haunt them for the rest of their lives was now seared into their minds. After this, what is there to go home to? How could they face their wives, their children, their parents, knowing that the flag they fought for was a shroud for the greatest crime in human history? They had been defeated militarily, intellectually, and now, completely and irrevocably, morally. Their world had not just ended. It had never truly existed. It had all been a monstrous lie. The end of the war did not bring an immediate homecoming. For the nearly 400,000 German prisoners, it marked the beginning of the final, most crucial phase of their captivity. They were men who had been stripped of everything, their cause, their honor, their nation's very identity. They were adrift in a moral vacuum, grappling with a collective guilt that was almost too heavy to bear. It was into this void that the American re-education program poured its final and most enduring lessons. With the fighting over, the curriculum in the camps shifted. The lessons were no longer just about American history or government. They became practical workshops on the very nature of a free society. The prisoners learned about federalism, trade, unions, a free press, and the principles of a market economy. They were given access to American newspapers and magazines, reading about the debates and disagreements that defined a healthy democracy. For men raised in a system where dissent was treason, the sight of a newspaper openly criticizing the president was a daily lesson in the resilience of a free society. When the time finally came for their repatriation, they did not return to Germany as the same men who had left it. They were profoundly and irrevocably changed. They had arrived in America as arrogant soldiers of a self-proclaimed master race, convinced of their own superiority. They were leaving as humble students of an ideology they had once despised. They had been defeated not by force of arms alone, but by an overwhelming force of evidence. They had seen the colossal output of free labor, the shocking abundance of a free market, and the incredible strength of a nation confident enough to expose its own flaws. One of those men, a former Luftwaffe officer named Hermann Göring, no relation to the infamous Reichsmarschall, later reflected on this transformation. He and his comrades, he said, had a unique perspective that no other Germans possessed. They hadn't just been told about the power of democracy. They had lived inside its engine room for years. We became, Göring stated, missionaries for democracy. They returned to a homeland that was a literal wasteland. German cities were seas of rubble, its economy non-existent, its people starving and demoralized. It was here, in the ruins of the Third Reich, that the true impact of their American experience took hold. While other Germans struggled to comprehend the totality of their defeat, these former prisoners understood it intimately. They knew what real industrial power looked like, and they knew Germany's war machine had been a child's toy by comparison. They became the unlikely architects of a new Germany. They were the engineers who knew how to organize a factory floor for maximum efficiency because they had witnessed Willow Run. They were the farmers who embraced mechanization because they had seen a single American farmer do the work of 100 German peasants. They were the teachers who taught their students the value of critical thinking and open debate because they had experienced it firsthand in a prison camp classroom. They were the politicians and civic leaders who helped draft the Constitution for the new Federal Republic of Germany, infusing it with the principles of democratic checks and balances they had come to admire. They were the bedrock of what the world would come to call the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. It was no miracle. It was the result of hard work, intelligent policy, and the quiet, determined efforts of hundreds of thousands of men who had seen the future. And it was a future built on freedom and production, not conquest and tyranny. When the United States announced the Marshall Plan, a massive infusion of aid to rebuild war-torn Europe, including their former enemy, many in Germany viewed it with suspicion. Was it a trick? A new form of economic enslavement? But for the former POWs, it made perfect, logical sense. They didn't see it as charity. They saw it as a strategic investment by a nation so wealthy and productive that rebuilding its competitors was a logical step to creating a stable, prosperous world. They had seen the careless abundance of America. They knew it could easily afford it. They became the plan's most ardent advocates, explaining to their skeptical countrymen that the American offer was genuine. Decades passed. The world changed. The Cold War rose and fell. In 1985, a small group of aging German men, now grandfathers with thinning white hair, traveled back to the United States. They came to a quiet, wooded park in Fort Hunt, Virginia, the former site of the secret intelligence and re-education camp known as P.O. Box 1142. They stood together on the soil where their transformation had been completed. One of the veterans, his voice thick with emotion, was asked to speak for the group. He looked at the American and German faces in the crowd, men who had once been mortal enemies, now gathered as friends. "We came to America as soldiers of a vile and evil cause," he said, his words a quiet testament to a long and painful journey. "We were deluded, arrogant, and convinced of a lie. We were stripped of our illusions by the undeniable truth of what we saw here. And we left not as enemies, but as friends. We left as men who had been shown the truth, and that truth allowed us to go home and build a better country." This story is more than just a forgotten chapter of World War II. It is a powerful, timeless lesson. It is proof that the most entrenched, hateful ideologies can be dismantled not by bombs and bullets, but by the overwhelming, undeniable power of truth and unexpected humanity. The German soldiers were conquered by an industrial might they could not comprehend, but they were transformed by a democratic confidence they could not deny. Their minds were freed not by propaganda, but by the simple, irrefutable evidence of their own eyes. Today, we live in a world saturated with information and disinformation. Ideologies clash not on battlefields, but in the digital spaces we inhabit every day. The weapons are no longer tanks and planes, but narratives and algorithms designed to divide and deceive. And so, the question this story leaves us with is a vital one. What is the industrial might of truth that we need to show the world today? In an age of deep fakes and curated realities, what is the undeniable evidence of freedom, of progress, of humanity that can break through the noise? Share your thoughts in the comments below. What lessons from your own life or family history have shown you that truth and empathy can be more powerful than hatred and lies? Your stories are part of this ongoing dialogue. Let's discuss it together.